The stage was set for what was supposed to be just another routine political debate on one of the most watched liberal talk shows in the country. Millions of viewers tuned in, expecting to witness a well-rehearsed ambush, a controlled spectacle where the conservative guest would be outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and ultimately humiliated under the relentless attacks of a seasoned liberal host. The studio lights burned bright, illuminating the sleek modern set where Josh Crane, the show's longtime anchor, adjusted his tie with the confidence of a man who had done this 100 times before. His reputation was built on his ability to corner conservative figures, cutting them off mid-sentence, twisting their words, and making them look defensive, uninformed, or, at best, completely unprepared. Across from him, seated with perfect posture and an unreadable expression, was Karoline Leavitt, a rising star in conservative politics, known for her sharp comebacks, unshakable confidence, and refusal to be bullied by the mainstream media. This was not the first time she had been invited onto a show like this under the guise of an honest debate, only to find herself the target of a carefully orchestrated takedown. She had walked into ambushes before, and each time she had left her opponents floundering in the wreckage of their own arrogance. But tonight was different. The energy in the studio crackled with an almost tangible sense of anticipation, an expectation that something explosive was about to unfold. The audience, carefully selected to ensure a majority of liberal supporters, leaned forward in their seats, ready to cheer as Crane tore into his guest. Off camera, the production team was already set for what they assumed would be a predictable segment, Crane launching into a monologue designed to put Leavitt on the defensive, a rapid-fire exchange where she would struggle to get a word in, and finally, a closing statement that would reaffirm the network's ideological stance and remind viewers why figures like Leavitt and the movement she represented were dangerous, misinformed, and undeserving of serious consideration. It was a formula that had worked before, but there was one critical flaw in their plan. They assumed she wouldn't fight back. As the countdown to air began, a voice crackled in Crane's earpiece, reminding him of the key talking points. The producers had done their research, meticulously crafting the narrative that would unfold. The strategy was clear: start with a misleading statistic, push an emotional argument, paint Leavitt as an extremist, and if all else failed, divert to a personal attack. Crane had done this dance before, and he relished the opportunity to dismantle another conservative guest live on air. He glanced at Leavitt, expecting to see the usual signs of nervousness that so many before her had displayed: a twitch of the fingers, a tightening of the jaw, a subtle glance at the cameras betraying discomfort. But she sat still, composed, her gaze steady and unyielding. There was no nervous fidgeting, no sign of uncertainty. It was almost unnerving. Crane smirked slightly, mistaking her calmness for naivety. He would enjoy this. The red light above the camera blinked on, signaling the beginning of the live broadcast. The introductory music played, and Crane leaned forward, offering the camera his signature confident smile. Welcome back to the round table, where we separate fact from fiction, expose the spin, and hold those in power accountable. Tonight, we have a special guest, someone who has made a name for herself as one of the loudest voices in the new conservative movement. She claims to stand for truth. But how much of what she says actually holds up under scrutiny? Please welcome Karoline Leavitt. The audience clapped, though a few skeptical murmurs rippled through the room. Leavitt didn't shift in her seat. She simply inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the introduction without the usual forced pleasantries. Crane wasted no time. Karoline, let's get right to it. The American people are tired of the misinformation, the manufactured outrage, and the divisive rhetoric that has taken over our political landscape. Just last week, former President Trump made the claim that under his leadership, America's economy was at its strongest. But let's look at the numbers, shall we? Under President Biden, unemployment is down, wages are up, and despite the constant fear-mongering from conservatives, the country is actually doing better. So my question to you is, why do figures like yourself continue to push the false narrative that America was somehow stronger under Trump when all the evidence suggests otherwise? The words were laced with the confidence of a man who had asked similar questions before and expected the same predictable reaction: a defensive scramble, a weak attempt at deflection, or, better yet, a meltdown. But Leavitt simply raised an eyebrow, allowing the silence to stretch just a fraction longer than was comfortable. Crane shifted slightly in his chair, realizing that he had just handed her the perfect opening, and she was about to take it. Leavitt took a slow breath, the corner of her lips twitching into something that wasn't quite a smile, but held the promise of something far more dangerous. She let the silence linger just long enough for discomfort to settle in, for the tension in the room to shift from control to uncertain. Crane had expected an immediate reaction, a flustered attempt at justification, maybe even an emotional outburst that he could seize on and pick apart. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, her eyes locked onto his with an almost amused detachment. "Josh," she finally said, her voice measured, firm and deliberate, "I'm glad you brought up numbers because numbers don't lie. But do you know what does? Selective statistics, cherry-picked data, ideas and networks that push an agenda rather than report the full picture. So let's talk about what you conveniently left out." The audience, which had been primed to react against her, suddenly seemed unsure of how to respond. The script they had been handed, the unspoken understanding that this was meant to be a one-sided dismantling, was beginning to crack, and they could feel it. Crane, however, refused to acknowledge the shift. He leaned back slightly, forcing an easy smile, but there was a flicker of something behind his eyes, a realization that the woman in front of him wasn't playing the role he had assigned her. Leavitt didn't wait for his response. She turned slightly toward the camera, her voice taking on the cadence of someone who knew exactly how to control the moment. Under Trump, the average gas price was $2.25. Under Biden, Americans are paying over $4 a gallon, with some states hitting nearly $6. Inflation under Trump, 1.4%. Inflation under Biden? It peaked at 9%. Mortgage rates under Trump were below 3%. Under Biden, they've skyrocketed past 7%. And let's talk wages, because I know that's your favorite manipulated talking point. Under Trump, real wages were rising. Under Biden, any increase in wages has been wiped out by historic inflation, meaning Americans actually have less purchasing power than they did 3 years ago. But sure, Josh, let's pretend the economy is booming. She folded her hands in her lap, letting the weight of her words settle. The studio was silent. Crane's jaw tightened just slightly before he forced a short laugh, shaking his head as if amused. "Karoline, that's a lovely recital of Republican talking points, but let's be honest, you're twisting the facts. Inflation is a global issue. Gas prices were impacted by worldwide supply chain disruptions. And let's not forget that the economic downturn started under Trump. You conveniently left out that small detail, didn't you?" Leavitt didn't flinch. Instead, she reached for a single sheet of paper that had been resting beside her on the table, lifting it with deliberate ease. "This," she said, holding it up for the cameras, "is a report from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, December 2020, the last full month before Biden took office. The inflation rate? 1.4%. Not a crisis, not an emergency, just a stable economy. And this," she lifted another page, "is from January 2022. Inflation had surged to 7.5% in just a year. So tell me, Josh, was that global forces? Or was it reckless policy decisions that flooded the economy with trillions in unnecessary spending while shutting down domestic energy production?" Crane's easy smile faltered for the first time. He opened his mouth to respond, but she wasn't finished. "And let's talk about your claim that Trump started the downturn. Do you really want to go there? Because I have another document right here, White House economic reports from early 2020 showing record low unemployment before the pandemic hit. The only reason we saw a spike in job losses was because of a global shutdown, which, by the way, Democrats insisted on prolonging well beyond its necessity. The moment restrictions were lifted, the economy rebounded at a record pace, with Trump leading the fastest recovery in modern history. Biden inherited that recovery. And you people pretend he built it from scratch. So, Josh, I'll ask again, who's really twisting the facts here?" The silence that followed was deafening. The audience, previously eager to applaud Crane's every assertion, now sat frozen, uncertain whether to cheer or remain quiet. Even the crew members behind the cameras seemed hesitant, their movements slower, their gazes flickering between Crane and the control room, waiting for direction on how to salvage the moment. Crane exhaled sharply through his nose, adjusting his tie, his fingers tapping against the table as he recalibrated. He wasn't used to being the one under pressure, but he wasn't about to back down. "Fine," he said, his tone cooling into something sharper. "Let's talk about something even more relevant. It's easy to throw out numbers and pretend they tell the full story, but what about character? What about trust? You sit here defending a man who is facing multiple indictments, lawsuits, and criminal investigations. Are you seriously telling the American people that a man with that much controversy surrounding him deserves to lead this country again?" A low murmur ran through the audience. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the knockout punch, the argument that would finally put her on the defensive. Leavitt tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "Josh," she said, her voice even, "do you believe in fairness?" Crane blinked, momentarily thrown off by the question. "Of course." "Great," she said smoothly. "Then let's be fair. If you're going to hold Trump to that standard, let's apply it across the board. Let's talk about Joe Biden's alleged influence peddling through his son Hunter. Let's talk about the multiple whistleblowers who have come forward with evidence suggesting financial corruption at the highest levels of his administration. Let's talk about the classified documents scandal that your network barely covered, despite the fact that Biden himself admitted to storing them in multiple unsecured locations, including his garage. And let's talk about the two-tiered justice system that aggressively passively pursues political opponents while giving a free pass to its allies." She leaned forward slightly, her gaze never wavering. "Tell me, Josh, when was the last time you asked a Democrat these questions?" The audience was no longer murmuring. They were staring. Crane's mouth opened slightly before he snapped it shut, his fingers tightening around his pen. He knew he had walked into a trap, and worse, he knew she had built it before he even stepped into it. Crane clenched his jaw as he searched for a way out, but the momentum had already shifted. The controlled environment he had relied on, the safety net of a friendly audience, and a production team ready to cut to commercial at the first sign of trouble, was slipping from his grasp. He was supposed to be the one steering this conversation, yet here he was, scrambling for footing, while Karoline Leavitt sat perfectly composed, waiting for his next move, like a predator watching its prey exhaust itself. He had played this game countless times before, but something about her was different. She wasn't just countering his arguments, she was exposing his tactics, and the worst part was that everyone in the room could feel it. He exhaled sharply, his fingers drumming against the desk as he forced a smirk, a transparent attempt to regain control. "You're very good at deflecting, Karoline," he said, his tone shifting into something condescending. "But let's not pretend that any of this changes the reality we're living in. Donald Trump is a deeply controversial figure, and whether you like it or not, most Americans are tired of the chaos that comes with him. We're talking about a man who incited an insurrection, refused to accept the results of a democratic election, and continues to spread dangerous conspiracy theories. And yet, you sit here and act like none of that matters." He leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on the sharp edge of someone who believed he had just cornered his opponent. "So let's put this simply, do you, Karoline, condone what happened on January 6th? Do you stand by a man who encouraged violence against his own country?" The audience murmured, sensing the tension rise again, expecting this to be the moment where she faltered, the moment where Crane would finally regain control. But Leavitt didn't even blink. She exhaled slowly, shaking her head, almost as if she were disappointed, as if she had expected better. And then she spoke. "Josh, I knew you'd bring this up, because when facts aren't on your side, you people always resort to the same tired script. You don't want to talk about policy, you don't want to talk about the economy, and you certainly don't want to talk about Biden's failures. No. You want to keep bringing up January 6th, because it's the only thing you have left." Crane opened his mouth, but she didn't give him the chance. She continued, her voice calm, deliberate, cutting through the manufactured outrage like a scalpel. But let's actually talk about it. Since you're so determined to discuss threats to democracy, let's talk about Hillary Clinton, who spent 4 years calling Trump an illegitimate president and claiming the 2016 election was stolen from her. Let's talk about Stacey Abrams, who refused to concede in Georgia and was treated like a hero for it by the very same media that now clutches its pearls over so-called election denialism. Let's talk about Democrats who, in 2017, objected to the certification of Trump's electoral vote, something you and your network conveniently forget when you pretend that questioning an election is some unprecedented crime. Her voice didn't rise, but the weight of her words did. The audience wasn't clapping anymore. The orchestrated energy in the room was unraveling, and Crane knew it. He shifted in his seat, a flicker of frustration flashing across his face as he attempted to cut in. That's completely. But she wasn't finished. And while we're at it, Josh, let's talk about actual political violence. Let's talk about the months of riots in 2020, when cities burned, businesses were destroyed, and people were attacked in the streets while your network called it mostly peaceful protests. Let's talk about a sitting Supreme Court justice nearly being assassinated outside his home because of rhetoric pushed by your side. Let's talk about the fact that just weeks ago, a deranged leftist attempted to assassinate Donald Trump at a rally, and yet your network refused to treat it with the same breathless hysteria that you dedicate to January 6th. Crane's smirk was gone now. His fingers curled around his pen, his eyes darting briefly to the control room, as if silently begging for an intervention. But no one was going to save him. Leavitt pressed forward. So no, Josh, I don't condone violence. I never have. But I also won't sit here and let you pretend that one side holds a monopoly on political unrest. The only difference is that when the left engages in it, the media covers for them. When the right does, you people act like it's the end of democracy. The silence in the studio was suffocating. The audience, once eager to jeer at her, now looked around uncertainly, processing what had just happened. The show had started with the expectation of a clear, decisive takedown of a conservative guest. Instead, they were witnessing their host unravel under the weight of his own hypocrisy. Crane swallowed hard, his face tightening. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to being on the defensive. He tried to muster a retort, but for the first time in his career, the words weren't coming as easily as he needed them to. His confidence, once unwavering, had been chipped away piece by piece, and Leavitt could see it. She tilted her head, almost as if she were studying him, as if she were waiting to see whether he had anything left in him. And when he remained silent for just a fraction too long, she delivered the final blow. "Tell me, Josh," she said, her voice deceptively light. "If Donald Trump is such a threat to democracy, then why is it that every time he's on a ballot, voter turnout breaks records? Why is it that his rallies draw tens of thousands of people while your network struggles to hold onto an audience? Why is it that despite every indictment, every attack, every smear campaign, he's still leading in the polls? Could it be, maybe, just maybe, that the American people don't buy the narrative you're selling?" Crane's face darkened, his grip tightening on the desk. He knew he couldn't answer that. He knew that no matter what he said next, it would only make things worse. Because she was right, and the cameras were rolling, and the entire country was watching him lose. Crane's breathing had become noticeably shallow, his usual effortless command of the conversation slipping away like sand through his fingers. The energy in the studio had shifted in a way that even the most oblivious audience member could feel. The smug confidence he had exuded at the beginning of the interview had evaporated, replaced with a thinly veiled desperation to claw his way back into control. But it was too late. The damage was done. And Karoline Leavitt knew it. She could see it in the way his jaw tightened, the way his hand clenched into a fist on the desk, the way he darted quick, nervous glances toward the producers behind the cameras, as if silently begging for a lifeline. But there would be no lifeline. He had walked into this thinking he was the one setting a trap, but now he was the one floundering inside it, and she was about to snap it shut. She didn't rush. That would have been a mistake. Instead, she let the silence stretch just a beat longer than necessary, letting the weight of his failure settle into the room. The audience, who had been primed to cheer for him, now sat frozen in an awkward limbo, unsure whether they were still allowed to view him as the dominant force in the debate. Even the producers seemed hesitant, their hands hovering over controls, trying to decide whether to cut to commercial or let the disaster play out. Crane cleared his throat, forcing a chuckle that did nothing to mask the tension in his voice. "All right, Karoline," he said, his tone straining to sound dismissive, as if he weren't moments away from completely unraveling. "You've made your little speech. I'm sure your followers on Twitter will love the sound bites. But let's be real for a second. The reason Donald Trump is under so much legal scrutiny isn't some grand media conspiracy. It's because he's actually broken the law. You and the rest of the MAGA crowd love to cry about political persecution, but in reality your guy is facing serious charges. He's been indicted on multiple counts across multiple states. These aren't just political attacks. Karoline, these are actual legal proceedings. Are you seriously going to sit there and tell me that none of it is legitimate?" The moment the words left his mouth, Karoline's expression shifted not to anger, not to frustration, but to something far more dangerous. Amusement. She leaned back slightly in her chair, tapping her fingers idly against the desk, as if she were contemplating how best to dismantle him next. When she spoke, her voice was almost playful, but with an unmistakable undertone of steel. "Josh," she said, tilting her head just slightly, "did you rehearse that line in the mirror this morning? Because I've heard it before, word for word, from every single talking head in the mainstream media. And yet, not one of you ever seems willing to apply the same scrutiny to the other side. So let's talk about that, shall we?" Crane's smirk faltered for just a second before he forced it back into place, but Karoline had already seen the crack. "You claim Trump's indictments prove he's a criminal," she continued, her voice smooth and even. "Well, let's take a look at some of the people who are actually sitting in power right now. Let's talk about Joe Biden, whose own DOJ interfered in an ongoing investigation into his family's business dealings. Let's talk about the FBI protecting Hunter Biden while millions of dollars flowed through shell companies directly tied to foreign governments. Let's talk about Hillary Clinton, who destroyed 33,000 emails after they were subpoenaed, used an unsecured private server to handle classified government information, and somehow miraculously never faced a single consequence. Let's talk about Barack Obama using the intelligence community to spy on political opponents. Let's talk about the blatant corruption that your network refuses to report on because it doesn't fit the narrative you've built." Crane's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. He had spent his career steamrolling over conservative guests, cutting them off, redirecting, twisting their words until they stumbled into a defensive position. But Karoline wasn't stumbling. She was taking his narrative and burning it to the ground. "And let's not forget," she continued, her eyes locked onto his with laser precision, "that these so-called serious charges against Trump have been pursued by prosecutors with clear political motivations. Alvin Bragg, the Manhattan DA, campaigned on the promise to go after Trump. Letitia James, the New York aide, called Trump an illegitimate president before she even took office. Jack Smith, the special counsel, has a history of partisan prosecutions, and yet you expect us to believe this is all just about justice and not a coordinated effort to take down a political opponent." The room was so silent that Karoline could hear the faint hum of the stage lights overhead. Crane swallowed, gripping the edges of his chair, as if he were physically trying to steady himself. His carefully controlled demeanor was cracking, and he knew it. Everyone knew it. Karoline let the moment settle before leaning forward slightly, lowering her voice just enough to make the audience lean in. "So tell me, Josh," she said, her tone almost gentle now, like a teacher guiding a struggling student through a difficult lesson, "if Donald Trump is the real threat to democracy, if his legal troubles are proof of his corruption, then why is it that the same system protecting actual criminals in Washington is going after him with everything they've got? Why is it that the people who scream the loudest about election interference are the same ones trying to throw their political opponent in jail before the next election?" Crane inhaled sharply, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to formulate a response. The audience wasn't reacting the way he had expected. There was no triumphant applause, no laughter at Karoline's expense, just an uncomfortable, heavy silence as the weight of what had just been said hung in the air. She let him sit in it for a moment longer before delivering the final, devastating blow. You don't actually care about democracy, Josh. You care about control. And the second you lose it like you're losing it right now, you call it a crisis. Crane exhaled sharply through his nose, his fists tightening against the table as the realization finally settled in. He had lost. And the cameras were rolling. And there was nothing he could do to stop what was coming next. Crane could feel his grip on the conversation slipping into complete free fall. He had started this interview with absolute certainty that he would dominate, that he would do what he had done to so many other conservative guests before, twist their words, corner them with loaded questions, and leave them stammering as he smugly delivered the final word. But Karoline Leavitt wasn't playing by his rules. She wasn't scrambling to defend herself. She wasn't reacting with outrage or stumbling over carefully crafted landmines. She was on the offensive, and worse, she had done something Crane had never expected. She had turned the audience against him. The tension in the studio wasn't just uncomfortable anymore. It was suffocating. And as the silence stretched between them, every second that ticked by only made it worse. He needed to regain control, and he needed to do it now. His mind raced through possible angles, searching for anything that could put her back on the defensive, anything that could wipe that calm, unshaken look off her face. And then, like a drowning man grabbing for a rope, he found his last weapon, one that had always worked before. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as he dropped the full professionalism in his voice, replacing it with something colder, something calculated. "You know what, Karoline," he said, his voice low and sharp. "For someone who talks a lot about fairness, you sure seem awfully comfortable defending a man who has been accused of some of the most heinous things imaginable. Let's not sugarcoat it, Trump has been accused of everything from fraud to sexual misconduct. And yet you sit here and act like he's some kind of saint. So tell me, do you think the dozens of women who have accused him of wrongdoing are all just lying? Are they all part of some grand conspiracy too?" There it was. The moment he had been waiting for. The one that had always worked in the past. It didn't matter whether the accusations had been proven false or politically motivated. The mere mention of them had been enough to send most conservatives into a desperate, stammering mess, fumbling over how to distance themselves while still attempting to defend Trump. But Karoline didn't flinch. In fact, she did something that made Crane's stomach twist with unease. She smiled. Not a forced, nervous smile. Not an attempt at dismissive amusement. A slow, knowing smile, like someone who had been expecting this exact moment and had already planned exactly how to destroy it. "I was wondering when you'd get desperate enough to go there," she said smoothly, leaning back in her chair as if she had all the time in the world. "I have to hand it to you, Josh. You really did hold out longer than I expected. But we both knew this was coming, didn't we? Because when you can't win on policy, when you can't argue with facts, you go straight for character assassination. It's the oldest trick in the book." Crane's smirk faltered just slightly, but he recovered, shaking his head with a forced laugh. "Come on, Karoline, don't dodge the question. These are serious allegations. And Joe Biden hasn't faced serious allegations," she cut in, her voice still calm, but now laced with something sharper, something dangerous. "Or does the rule only apply to one side? Because last time I checked, the sitting president of the United States wasn't just accused of inappropriate behavior, he was accused of sexual assault by a woman who worked directly for him. And what did your network do? Did you give her wall-to-wall-to-wall coverage? Did you demand investigations, hold emotional interviews? Demand he drop out of his campaign? No, you ignored it, you buried it. And when it became impossible to ignore, you dismissed it as unsubstantiated. Funny how that works, isn't it?" Crane shifted in his seat, opening his mouth, but Karoline wasn't finished. "And while we're talking about credibility, let's talk about Christine Blasey Ford," she continued, her tone still smooth, still measured. "Your network dragged Brett Kavanaugh through the mud over an accusation that had zero evidence, no corroboration, and that was conveniently brought forward at the last possible moment before his confirmation. You paraded her around as a hero. But when Tara Reid accused Joe Biden, suddenly, believing all women wasn't so important anymore. The audience was silent, completely, utterly silent. Karoline tilted her head slightly, letting the tension settle before delivering the final cut. So tell me, Josh, she said, her voice quiet but razor-sharp, do you actually care about holding powerful men accountable? Or do you just care about destroying the ones who stand in your way? Crane exhaled slowly, pressing his lips together so tightly that the color drained from them. His fingers drummed against the desk in an uneven rhythm, betraying the frustration simmering just beneath the surface. He knew he had lost this round. And worse, he knew there was nothing he could say to take back the damage that had just been done. But he still had one last card to play. The nuclear option. All right, Karoline, he said, sitting up straighter, his voice carefully controlled now, the desperation masked behind faux professionalism. You're great at spinning things, I'll give you that. But let's get real for a second. You represent a movement that has embraced extremism, that has fueled division, that has turned political disagreements into outright hostility. You can act like you're the rational one all you want. But at the end of the day, you are part of a party that has openly embraced dangerous rhetoric, and that rhetoric has consequences. January 6th was a direct result of the kind of inflammatory rhetoric your movement pushes. The rise in political violence, the threats. The attacks your party has enabled this, and whether you want to admit it or not, you have blood on your hands. The audience tensed. Even some of the most loyal liberal supporters in the crowd seemed uneasy with the directness of the accusation. It was a risky move, but Crane had no other option left. He had to paint her as a dangerous extremist, a propagandist for a radical ideology, someone too toxic to be taken seriously. If he couldn't win the argument, he had to make sure she lost credibility in the process. Karoline studied him for a moment, then exhaled, shaking her head. That's cute, Josh, she said softly, almost pityingly. But let me tell you what actually fuels division. It's not people like me, it's people like you. People who spend every single day demonizing half the country. People who label anyone who disagrees with them a threat to democracy. People who smear political opponents as extremists while excusing violence from their own side. You want to talk about rhetoric? Your network spent 4 years pushing the lie that Trump was a Russian agent. Your network defended riots in 2020. Your network downplayed an assassination attempt on a former president. And now you sit here and pretend that it's my side that's dangerous. Crane's knuckles were white against the desk. He had nowhere left to go. And Karoline knew it. The truth is, Josh, she said, your network doesn't want unity. It doesn't want reasoned debate. It wants power. And the only thing more terrifying to you than a Republican you can smear as a monster is one who refuses to play your game. Crane swallowed hard, but no words came. The cameras were rolling, and he was out of moves. Crane sat frozen, his usual smirk long gone, his carefully crafted mask of control slipping beyond repair. His fingers curled against the desk, his knuckles white, his breath shallow as he realized there was no way out. He had spent his career tearing apart conservative guests, turning their words against them, drowning them in interruptions and derailing their arguments with accusations they were never allowed to properly refute. But this time was different. This time, he had been the one put on the defensive, the one forced to stammer and scramble, the one whose own hypocrisy had been dragged into the light for the world to see. And the worst part, the cameras were rolling. The audience was watching. And Karoline Leavitt knew she had him exactly where she wanted him. She let the silence stretch just long enough for the weight of his failure to settle into the air, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Then, with the same effortless poise she had maintained throughout the entire exchange, she leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with him. So what's it going to be, Josh, she asked, her voice calm but with an unmistakable edge. Are you going to sit here and keep pretending that you have the moral high ground? Or are you finally going to admit what everyone watching already knows, that this was never about facts, never about justice, never about democracy? This was about power, and you just lost it. Crane opened his mouth, but no words came. He inhaled sharply through his nose, his eyes flicking toward the control booth, searching for some sort of intervention. But the producers weren't looking at him anymore. They were looking at Karoline. They were watching the power dynamic in the room shift in real time, realizing that they had underestimated her, realizing that their golden boy had been humiliated in front of millions. The silence stretched unbearably, and the audience, who had come in expecting a dominant performance from Crane, had no idea how to react. They had been primed to cheer when he dismantled his guest, to laugh at her discomfort, to enjoy the spectacle of another conservative figure being reduced to a footnote in a viral takedown. But that hadn't happened. Instead, they had watched him break. They had watched him lose. And now many of them were simply staring, shifting uncomfortably in their seats, glancing at one another, as if silently asking whether they were still supposed to be on his side. Crane swallowed hard, forcing himself to sit up straighter. He needed to say something, anything, to reassert control. That's an interesting way to spin things, Karoline, he said finally, though his voice lacked the confidence it had before. But the truth is, the American people are tired of this kind of rhetoric. They're tired of division. They're tired of politicians playing the victim. And frankly, they're tired of people like you who refuse to accept reality. Karoline let out a short laugh, shaking her head. That's rich, coming from the guy who spent the last hour desperately trying to spin his way out of his own contradictions. She turned to the camera, her gaze steady, unshaken. This is why people don't trust the media anymore. They don't report the news. They manufacture it. They manipulate, they censor, they lie, and when you call them out, when you refuse to play along, they panic. Just like Josh is panicking right now. The audience made a noise, a mix of nervous laughter, scattered gasps, even a few claps from the more neutral observers in the crowd, who were beginning to realize they had just witnessed something historic. Crane's face burned red, his frustration now visible for all to see. He reached up, adjusting his earpiece as if waiting for an instruction, but nothing came. His producers weren't going to save him. His network wasn't going to save him. And Karoline certainly wasn't going to let him escape without making sure he understood exactly how thoroughly he had been defeated. So go ahead, Josh, she continued, her voice now dangerously soft. Go ahead and tell your audience that you won this debate. Tell them you held me accountable. Tell them you proved your point. And then watch as the internet tears you apart, clip by clip, because the truth is sitting right here for everyone to see. Crane exhaled sharply, staring at her for a long moment. His fingers drummed anxiously against the desk. He knew she was right. He knew this would be all over social media before the hour was up. And he knew that no matter how hard his network tried to spin it, they couldn't unwrite what had just happened. The control room finally made a decision. The producer's voice crackled in his earpiece. We need to go to break, now. Crane straightened, forcing a strained smile. We're out of time, he said, his voice tight. We'll be right back. The second the red light above the camera went dark, the studio erupted into chaos. But Karoline Leavitt, she just sat there, smiling. She had won. And everyone knew it. The moment the cameras cut to commercial, the carefully controlled illusion of the show shattered like glass. Crane ripped out his earpiece, slamming it onto the desk as his crew scrambled around him. Producers whispered furiously into headsets, technicians fumbled with controls, and stage managers waved their hands frantically, trying to regain order. But there was no fixing what had just happened. Karoline Leavitt had walked into the lion's den and walked out completely unscathed, leaving their star host humiliated in front of millions. And now, as the realization sank in, the panic in the studio was palpable. Crane pushed back from the desk, his face still flushed, his breathing heavy. He turned toward the control booth, his voice sharp and laced with frustration. Why didn't you cut her off sooner, he snapped. Why the hell did you let her run the clock like that? A tense silence followed. The producers exchanged uneasy glances, but no one answered. Because they all knew the truth, no matter when they had cut, the damage was already done. Karoline, meanwhile, sat calmly in her seat, unbothered by the chaos around her. She had nothing left to prove. The segment was over. She had said everything she needed to say, and the fallout was now out of her hands. But she wasn't in a rush to leave. No, she was going to enjoy this moment. She casually took a sip of water, then looked over at Crane, who was still fuming, his hands clenched into fists. "You all right, Josh?" she asked, her voice light, almost amused. "You look a little stressed." Crane's jaw tightened. He didn't respond. He couldn't. Anything he said now would only make it worse. The control room finally gave him the signal he had less than 2 minutes before they were live again, before he had to look into the camera and pretend that everything was fine. But it wasn't. And the second the broadcast ended, the real nightmare would begin. Because while Crane was trapped in a failing segment, the internet was already tearing him apart. Within minutes, clips of the exchange flooded social media. One particular moment, Karoline's devastating line, "Go ahead, Josh, tell them you won this debate," was already going viral. The comment sections erupted. "This is brutal. She just ended his career on live TV. This might be the worst takedown I've ever seen." The hashtags Josh crashed and Media BS exposed shot to the top of Twitter's trending list. Conservative commentators seized the moment, flooding their channels with reaction videos dissecting Crane's meltdown. Even liberal media figures struggled to spin it. Some ignored the segment entirely. Others tried to frame it as yet another example of conservative misinformation, but it wasn't landing. Because no matter how they tried to twist it, the raw footage was everywhere, and people could see the truth with their own eyes. Sponsors noticed too. By the next morning, at least 3 major advertisers quietly pulled their ads from the network, issuing vague statements about reviewing partnerships. Crane's bosses were now in crisis mode, holding emergency meetings to figure out how to contain the fallout. But there was no containing it. The clip had already amassed millions of views. The headlines were "Ruthless Josh Crane faces career-ending backlash after humiliating live debate. Karoline Leavitt turns the tables in spectacular on-air takedown." How one conservative guest just exposed the media's biggest hypocrisy. By midday, the network made its first move, releasing an official statement claiming that heated debates are part of the democratic process and that they stand by the integrity of their journalism. It was a weak attempt at damage control, and it failed miserably. The pressure didn't let up. Viewers flooded the station with complaints demanding answers. The story wasn't dying, it was growing. And then, less than 48 hours later, the final blow landed. An internal memo leaked, one from the producers of Crane's show. In it, a senior executive bluntly admitted that the interview had gone disastrously off script and that Crane had failed to maintain control of the segment. Worse, the memo revealed that the network had deliberately planned to ambush Karoline, instructing Crane to cut her off frequently and frame her as an extremist. The document spread like wildfire. News outlets, even some left-leaning ones, picked it up. It was undeniable proof of media bias. And now, with no way to spin it, the network had no choice. The next morning, Crane was placed on temporary leave. The official statement claimed it was to allow for internal discussions about the direction of the show, but everyone knew what it really meant. His career was over. Meanwhile, Karoline Leavitt? She had never been more powerful. In the days that followed, she was everywhere, invited onto major conservative platforms, praised for standing her ground, for exposing the game that mainstream media played. Her following exploded, donors flooded her campaign, her influence skyrocketed. And when she was asked in a follow-up interview what she thought about Crane's suspension, she simply smiled and said, "The truth has a way of taking care of itself." And just like that, the media had lost.